Hello, my name is David Lantz, and I want to welcome you to my webinar, The Undoing of the Unraveling. Now, I just want to let you know that the way this is set up, you may be able to post questions and so forth, but because of the way I have this set up, I'm not going to be able to do the webinar and interact with you. So I hope that you'll bear with me on that. At any rate, later today, I want you to know that I'll be publishing a replay link that you can use to watch the video and or share it with others if you so desire. Some of you perhaps listening in on the webinar today know that America was founded on the twin ideas of individual liberty and limited government. We've always believed in the ideal that human beings can be left free as individuals and families to live their lives as they see fit, coming together voluntarily to solve their joint problems. But now, I think that there's this growing sense that that unique American culture is unraveling. And so as we think about this, I believe that we are at this moment in time facing a looming fiscal crisis. And at the same time, we seem to be confused over our own soul, asking who we are and what it is that we actually believe in. What I want to do today in this webinar is talk about how we got to the state that we're in and call the unraveling of the American way of life. And second, I want to talk about what can be done about it to start to undo the unraveling. So I hope you'll stay with me until the end of the presentation when I discuss that. Now, there is a Latin phrase, festina lente, which means to make haste slowly. The concept here is that the starting point of any reform must be first to identify the philosophy at the heart of the problem, and then to ensure that the idea behind the solution is sound. Otherwise, any reform efforts we may seek to undertake will be no more than just merely shadow boxing. Now, one of the things that I've thought about in regard to this whole process is the idea that when we look at what we would call civics education, we've been shadowboxing with things called Common Core, the privacy of student data, outcome-based education, and a variety of other things. I think it's time to get back to the core elements of what is truly happening. You know, if you look at President George Washington's inaugural address, you'll see that in that speech, he said that the foundation of our national policy will be laid in the pure and immutable principles of private morality. And so I think we need a reference point, a standard that says this is the measure of X. Washington's statement is that reference point. Today, we see sexual bullying by Hollywood and Washington elites. We see racial unrest. We see murderous rampages, the media war on traditional family values and marriage. And what do they all mean? Well, I feel that unless halted and reversed, they mean the unraveling of we the people. You know, some years ago, when my daughter Sarah was a junior in high school, she said to me, "Dad, it says on our money that in God we trust, so why don't we?" Well, I've written a book called The Unraveling of We the People, and that's what this webinar is based on, in part as my way to answer the question that my daughter asked so many years ago. And I hope to be able to address and talk about this in today's conversation with you all. You know, in every generation, the older people sort of look at the younger folks and say, where has the morality gone? That's not really what I'm talking about today. Instead, I feel like I'm saying I firmly believe that what we read and what we experience transforms our minds and shapes our character. And so if you think back to the Great Depression times, those were tough times, but people would wait in line in order to sign up for work, food at soup kitchens, welfare, and things of that nature. Today, I think of a Black Friday after Thanksgiving, and people are tearing each other apart to get to the gifts there at Walmart or Target or where have you. And even the Philadelphia Eagles, after they won the Super Bowl, the people in that city torched and rioted their own city as they celebrated their team's winning. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I've missed something, but that didn't used to happen. And so my question is, what is actually has happened and what has changed the character of the American people? If you go back in history, you'll find that there was something called the McGuffey Eclectic Reader. It was something that was used in the grade schools from about the 1830s up until about the 1940s. A man by the name of John Westerhoff III, in his book McGuffey and His Readers, wrote that the book portrayed God as creator, preserver, and governor. Now, I want to spend a moment just on that idea of a governor. I had to think about this a little bit because I am by no means a mechanically inclined individual. But if you think about a thermostat in your house, you set the thermostat at a certain temperature, and something inside called the governor detects when the temperature is beginning to either go too low if it's cold in the winter, or too hot if it's hot in the summer. And that governor then tells the thermostat, which then tells the furnace or the air conditioning unit to kick in. And so, in the same way, God, through the Holy Spirit in the people, acts as a governor on us so that we have worked now to remove God from school. And if you're not into religion, just simply think of the movie Pinocchio, where Jiminy Cricket says, "Let your conscience be your guide." Well, it turns out that a researcher by the name of Dr. Lincoln Mullen at the George Washington University got very interested in the fact that Bible verses kept popping up in newspapers during the 1800s. And so he began to dig into that and was especially interested in the year 1876, because in that year, 1 Samuel 3:4 kept popping up in the newspapers across America. What Mullen began to realize was that the verse was being used by a guy named Samuel Tilden, a Democrat who was running for president, because the verse said, quote, "The Lord then called Samuel, and he answered, 'Here I am.'" So what Lincoln Mullen determined was that Tilden was to use the Bible verse in the same way that we would today use a bumper sticker in a political campaign. Now, this may sound strange in the year 2018, but back in 1876, people would have known what 1 Samuel 3:4 was and would have known all about it. And what Mullen learned was that the sermons were being published in the newspapers of the 1800s and early 1900s, as well as crossword puzzles based on the Bible. And so both as children and as adults, moral character was being created and preserved and emphasized, which went along with Washington's point about our national policy being laid in the private morality of our people. Now, in recent years, there's been some controversy over the words "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance. Have you ever wondered how they came to be in the pledge? Well, it has a lot to do with the conclusion of the Gettysburg Address, in which Lincoln said, "We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, and that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth." Well, certainly this concept of God being the foundation of the American way of life was important throughout much of our history. In his 1954 sermon, Pastor George Doherty gave that a sermon called "Under God" on the 150th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's birth. And so within 3 months of giving that sermon, the words "under God," which were taken out of the Gettysburg Address, were added to the Pledge of Allegiance, which at that time did not include the words "under God." And so Doherty said in his quote, "To omit the words 'under God' in the Pledge of Allegiance is to omit the definitive character of the American way of life." Clearly, at least at one point in our history, the words "under God" were emblematic of the American way of life. And so one might ask, what happened to civics education and the American way of life? And that's what I'd like to turn to next. And so it's at this point in the story that the American character begins to change. One of the things that began to happen in the 1850s and onward was that a man by the name of Horace Mann came along. He wanted to reform the education system by adopting what was called the Prussian education system. Prussia was the forerunner of what we call modern Germany. Now, this Prussian education model then began to enforce a top-down, government-run education system that was in competition with the McGuffey eclectic readers, based on a bottom-up teaching about the centrality of Christian faith in the American way of life. So Horace Mann's use of the Prussian system was ushered in what we would today call the factory model of school concept of education, and that's how that was born. Now, there's an organization called the National Association of Scholars, which in early 2017 came out with a report titled Making Citizens, How American Universities Teach Civics. And in that report, they talked about this process that happened, that from the 1880s onward, a generation of historians sought to reorientate American civics education around the new professional history standards. Students would now learn civics not only to inculcate patriotism and improve character, but also to practice memory, acquire facts, and make sense of these facts by applying imagination, judgment, disciplined and methodical thinking. And at the time, America was moving from a very rural-based to a more urban-based population. The Industrial Revolution was going on. And so you can certainly understand, if you read the writings of the day, how this was coming about. But they also pointed out that, in other words, the intellectual formation of a history professor from Weilheim, Germany, was to be superimposed on the education of American school children, not least to justify the employment of specialized professional history teachers in America's schools. And so there was a beginning change of refocusing away from students toward the professionalization of the teaching profession. And so one of the things that began to happen in the late 1800s, a reformer by the name of John Dewey, not to be confused with the John Dewey that ran for president in 1948 against Truman, but rather the John Dewey of the Library Dewey Decimal System. He began to look at what was going on with the Prussian education system and said, you know, I really don't like that it's let's get rid of it. And Dewey wanted to progress on from this system, and so he became the founder of what became known as the progressive movement. Dewey went on to the other extreme of the spectrum, so to speak. He wanted to get rid of teaching out of textbooks, as he felt that was irrelevant, especially the teaching of history. Additionally, he didn't like standardized textbooks because he didn't want to impose the moral values of the adults onto the tableau noir of the blank slate of the students. He felt students should be allowed to develop their own morals and ethics, principally through the process of learning by doing, or what we might today call various kinds of social learning types of activities. And so this wave of reform, led by John Dewey and the progressive movement, led to the 1916 report on social studies, subdividing traditional civics education into the compartmentalized subjects of history, economics, political science, and psychology. Now, I teach economics and political science. Many people who teach those subjects only have a knowledge base in one subject. I majored in history, political science, and economics. And so one of the things that I see is the value of being able to cross-pollinate across disciplines. What we did was we broke up that ability to transfer knowledge from one to another and compartmentalize it. So in effect, the progressives transformed the all-around civics education of the one-room schoolhouse into the departmentalized education of the modern high school. Another thing that Dewey promoted was what we would call service learning projects, from which students would learn how to become socialized in the modern world. Dewey believed that one should give pupils something to do, not necessarily something to learn. Doing things, he thought, would demand thinking on the part of students, and thus learning would naturally result. Dewey felt that students would naturally learn stuff that way. Now, I'm all in favor of having projects for students to work on, but only after they've grasped the fundamentals of the subject matter that they're dealing with. Not only did John Dewey and his disciples want to get rid of that method of teaching, he wanted to get rid of the teaching of history and character education, which meant that he also saw a need to get Christianity out of the public schools. With the rise of the Soviet Union, they saw the possibility to substitute the scientific method and a form of social Darwinism into the public schools to create a more progressive society. And so George Counts had traveled to Russia in the 1920s and had come back to America wishing to implement the sort of economic system through the teaching of a revamped social studies curriculum here in the United States. Counts and Dewey both served on the PhD dissertation committee of another man by the name of Norman Woelfel. Norman Woelfel went on to be the head of the School of Education at the Ohio State University. But Woelfel published his dissertation in book form in 1933 under the title Molders of the American Mind. It went through 3 printings during the depths, the worst years of the Great Depression. Woelfel in his book talked about Christian teaching and economic individualism, and he felt that those things stood in the way of the sorts of things the progressives were trying to do. In his book, Woelfel said, and I quote, "The things of highest value of individual experience and ethical standards in modern America will not, however, be found out so long as intellectual leaders maintain a sensitivity over the supernatural significance of Christian mythology or a sentimental personal attachment to the character of Jesus." And so, right there, we see the undermining of what had been tried to be taught through the McGuffey eclectic readers, instead substituting a new type of morality into our system. This was the beginning of an effort to remove the Bible's influence. Now, to be honest, this was going to be a bit of a challenge, given that in 1896, the Supreme Court had, under the case Church of the Holy Trinity, had said that the United States was a Christian people. But eventually, the concepts of what the progressives were wanting to put forward made their way into the various court cases. In 1947, there was a famous case called Everson versus the Board of Education. Justice Hugo Black was for the first time, introduced the concept that Jefferson had mentioned in his letter that he wrote when speaking to the Danbury Baptist Association of Connecticut, and he mentioned this separation between church and state. Black applied that to the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment of the Constitution. That was the first time that he did it. Now, Hugo Black was not successful in getting his ideas incorporated into the majority opinion in Everson versus Board of Education. But about 15 years later, in a case called Engel versus Vitale, Justice Hugo Black was the author of the majority opinion. This was the decision that removed prayer from the public schools. And so we went from the concept of an establishment of religion being something where a legislative body like the Congress declared a certain denomination as the established faith, and therefore we would raise taxes to support that denomination, to instead declare that any sort of religious activity in which a government official might participate, such as offering a prayer, being the establishment of religion that the Constitution now prohibited, thus turning the Establishment Clause on its head. Interestingly, if you look at the biography of Hugo Black, written by Roger Newman, there's a conversation with Hugo Black's daughter, or with Hugo Black, where he said, and acknowledged the influence of John Dewey's functional approach to his legal thoughts. He said, quote, "My daughter has frequently told people that if they want to find out what I think, they should go to Dewey's works." And so we see a direct connection between the teachings of Dewey and then the decisions of various justices like Hugo Black in our legal system. So once we defined saying a prayer as an establishment of religion, schools gradually became hostile to the inclusion of anything Christian in the education process. By the mid-1970s, schools began to graduate students who had never had any sort of Bible teaching in their various classes. Interestingly, it was 12 years after Engel versus Vitality in 1974 that the very first college business ethics courses were begun to be taught. Why? Well, because by that point in time, the teaching of situational ethics, introduced by a man by the name of Joseph Fletcher in a book called Situational Ethics in 1966, had led to the graduating of people who had no kind of firm foundations in ethical thinking. Schools of business decided it was important that students at the college level be taught ethics, something they evidently had previously not felt was needed. In 1987, a man by the name of Alan Bloom wrote a book titled The Closing of the American Mind. He looked at this loss of our moral bearings and the rise of what we now call logical and moral relativism. Bloom traced what had begun to happen in the schools, which were once the federal government began to become increasingly involved with location, and B, the diluting of critical thinking skills of Americans as Fletcher's situational ethics and C-spot run basal readers started to replace Christian-based character education and the use of the McGuffey readers. Bloom recognized that what Alexis de Tocqueville had warned about in his 1837 book, Democracy in America, that is, that individuals could become enslaved to public opinion, or what we today might call political correctness, was in fact a real danger. By submitting to political correctness, individuals would live with the fiction that they really decided things for themselves and their own morality for themselves. Fletcher's book, Situational Ethics, published in 1966, created a movement in which students had the excuse of whatever their parents and their grandparents might once have called sin to simply be nothing more than a lifestyle choice. Thus, we moved away from the ideal that there is something called sin, something called right and wrong. At about the same time, an assault was being made on economics here in the United States. A woman by the name of Amity Shales, in her book, The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression, focused on the year 1936 as the year that we created the modern entitlement challenge, as Roosevelt figuratively rewrote the definition of the word liberal, changing its application from individual liberty and individual rights to that of group identity and group rights. Shales noted that the Roosevelt administration took an 1883 essay titled The Forgotten Man by a man named Sumner. The Forgotten Man works this way. Imagine two rich men, A and B, who observe a third man, X, who is in need. They decide to use the machinery of government bureaucracy to transfer wealth to this third man, X. But the man who actually pays for the wealth transfer is neither A nor B, but a fourth man whom we'll call C, whom we today might say is among the middle or lower middle class. In Sumner's original construct, C was the forgotten man that made the welfare recipient, and what FDR did was he made the welfare recipient C rather than X, the forgotten man. And so Sumner first wrote about that in 1883, and so by the 1930s, FDR had totally redone that. Shales continued, quote, to justify giving to one forgotten man, the administration found, it had to make a scapegoat of another. Businessmen and businesses were the targets. Researcher Charles Murray has detailed how the character of the American people has been changed in his book, Coming Apart. Murray talks about what he calls the four founding virtues of American society, those being religion, industriousness, marriage, and honesty, and how they've begun to collapse. What is the logical outcome over a sustained period of time if trying to teach people to be ethical, if you don't also teach them the existence of a divine creator, or the need to put in a full day's work for a full day's wage? Because quite frankly, that is not only the right thing to do, but it gives you a sense of self-worth. If you don't teach those things, then the logical outcome is that these two trends will grow and take hold in the behavior of American people, resulting in having a society in which fewer and fewer people see the value in working hard for the sake of working hard, or being willing to create jobs that employ others, and a society in which more and more people have come to see the coercion of others as a means to get the result they want. This growing class of people will in turn expect, nay, demand that somebody else, that is the rich, be forced to take care of them. And so the virtue of industriousness is shaped in the home. But where is the father who can teach his son the importance of hard work if we kill marriage and turn a blind eye to the growth of out-of-wedlock childbirth? In May of 2011, the Indianapolis Star, which is the main newspaper where I live, carried an article titled, "Marrieds Are Now a Minority." Census says more households helmed by singles and cohabitants. In the 2010 census, married couples represented only 48% of all households, and that was the first time that that percentage had fallen below 50%. And so married couples were now a minority. This trend in fatherless sons, in turn, leads to an increase in poverty and a decrease in industriousness. The growth of government anti-poverty programs has created financial incentives to get divorced in order to qualify for welfare benefits, and then, in the next place, to never get married at all. Today, we've got some 40 million Americans who are on food stamps. And so, instead of teaching boys to value hard work, we are instead teaching them to hold their hand out and expect some sort of benefit from the rest of society. And so as we think about this, the disciples of Dewey, people like Counts and Woelfel and others, worked with their progressive educationalists to sow the seeds of Marxist thinking in our public schools. The progressives believed that humans could become selfless and collectivist, and so found common cause with the tenets of communism. They decided that they could do away with the biblical concept of sin, and instead they thought that if we just worked hard enough, people would become good people all on their lonesome without the effects of God's holy word and the sound teaching of morality and ethics. And so now, in the 21st century, we see that we've become a broken society. So why don't the progressives admit that they've made a wrong turn at Albuquerque, as Bugs Bunny once would have said in a cartoon? Well, I believe it's because the progressives spawned a new generation of liberal activists in the 1960s, and these liberal activists have now grown up and are in the various schools of education, training up new people to carry on their liberal message. In particular, they've learned how to use social media and dominate what I call the viral loop. George Soros founded something called the Open Society Foundation. Now, his foundation provides funding for a lot of groups, including the Center for Public Integrity. Now, that sounds like a great organization, but on the board of directors for the Center of Public Integrity is a woman by the name of Arianna Huffington. You might recognize her as being the co-founder of a publication that bears her name, the Huffington Post. She co-founded that with a younger man by the name of Jonah Peretti, who himself went on to found another company called BuzzFeed. And so that is how this process began to happen. If you take time to trace through what's going on, these people are working to get on the internet to push out a lot of news and information onto the web. The Huffington Post alone is the #1 rated political news website with over 110 million unique monthly viewers every month. That's as of December 2016. In fact, my son Josh, who's 31, a millennial, the only news source he recognizes is the Huffington Post because that's what hits his phone. BuzzFeed, along with 2 other sites, Upworthy and PolicyMic, are also out there. They then take very short clips of these various news articles and promote them out onto the internet through what is called viral marketing. For example, Eli Pariser and Peter Koechley were both working for MoveOn.org and helped elect Barack Obama as president in 2008 before they went on to found Upworthy. Chris Olchek is the CEO of another viral website called PolicyMic. He worked with the National Council of Economic Advisors under President Barack Obama. And so these younger accolades of the progressive movement and others like them have come along to be able to work with social media and the internet to be able to influence younger voters, particularly millennials. Now, the Huffington Post has more monthly visitors than the next 6 political news sites combined, at least at the end of 2016. The Blaze by Glenn Beck at that time was number 2 with only 25 million unique viewers. BuzzFeed has 150 million unique viewers, and Upworthy has nearly is number 2 with 45 million unique viewers. And so these groups working in tandem then are able to push out through what I'll call the viral loop information of a liberal bent into the public social media stream of consciousness. And so one of the things that people say is that we should teach civics, and certainly there's a need for that. Only about half of the states in the country actually require civics education in K through 12 education. What should civics education include? Well, traditional civics has normally included 3 things in the history, one of them being the history of your nation and its philosophical foundations. A second one is looking at how our government works and a citizen's role in America's representative democracy. Things like how a bill becomes a law, how our political system works, and what the framers of the Constitution intended for the process to do. That was something that and then the third one is, and perhaps most important, the creation of an inner moral virtue. And so how do we do that? How do we create that inner moral virtue? That was something that the McGuffey readers were very good at helping to train up people with moral virtue, because they taught history, they taught biography, and through the study of biography in the Bible, one could begin to see how good moral living resulted in right decisions and how bad moral living resulted in bad decisions. But this is not the progressive left's means of civics education. In fact, the hippie boomers who are now in authoritative government, business, and academic positions are teaching what some have called the new civics. The poster child of this movement is a man by the name of Bill Ayers. Now, in the 1960s, he was the head of what was called the Weather Underground. He went out and spent a lot of time in prison for that. I call Ayers the poster child for the liberal baby boom movement because he is today a school reform activist. Bill Ayers is the distinguished professor of education and senior university scholar in residence at the University of Illinois in Chicago, retired. Bill Ayers and those folks that now have moved into the positions of academia and other places to continue to promote the progressive ideas of John Dewey and his acolytes. Bill Ayers has worked, for example, with the Department of Education to obtain funding grants for what is called service learning in the community. This sort of service learning, however, includes groups like Antifa, funded by George Soros, to go and create riots at various public forums that are more in line with some of the things that have come out of the service learning and social justice type of curriculum. And so, why is America unraveling? Well, here's a thesis that I've put together based on my research. First, there is a concerted effort begun in the 1920s to remove the moral teachings of Christianity and the principle of economic self-reliance. Second, the 60s generation that despised Christianity and proclaimed sex, drugs, and rock and roll has now risen to power in academia, business, and in government. And then third, they are now in a position to promote this new civics that undermines our traditional form of constitutional government. At the beginning of the webinar, I introduced the concept of festina lente, to make haste slowly, by first identifying the philosophy at the heart of the problem in order to ensure that the idea behind the solution is sound. So in order to decide what we might do, we first have to acknowledge that we face some significant obstacles. Now, when I say significant obstacles, that does not mean that it's impossible to fix things. It just means that it's hard and will take concentrated effort. So first, there's what I'll call the long tail effect. Understand that what I've been describing here in this webinar are not things that most people know about. And so the issue is, how do people that have an in-depth knowledge of what I've been talking about communicate that to the masses of people who frankly don't know and don't care that they don't know about these sorts of things? The second obstacle is that you have teachers of traditional civics who quite frankly feel isolated. They're in their little foxholes doing what they can to further a conservative constitutional form of education, but they feel like they're all alone. and that there's no one supporting them, especially as this juggernaut of federal involvement in education rolls over everything. The third obstacle is that the conservative academic class, frankly, is not very proactive. They love to give speeches, hold symposiums, and write papers that only other academics read, but they never get their hands dirty and their feet wet by rolling up their sleeves and getting involved in grassroots politics. The fourth obstacle is that while there are grassroots activists who have come up through the Tea Party types of organizations, regular people, moms and dads, grandmas and grandpas who care deeply about what's going on, they typically don't have the academic background to understand how do we put together good curriculum that teaches the things that we want taught. And so how such things as how curriculum is developed, how it's taught, and some of the key historical underpinnings of what is taught, and how we connect the dots throughout the subjects that we teach. And so these grassroots activists are, in a sense, leaderless. And so what might we do? Well, first of all, a simple thing that we can do is something that 15 states already require, to simply require that before graduation from high school, a student must pass the United States Citizens Civics Test that all new U.S. citizens must pass when they come to America and want to become legal citizens. Now, there's an organization, the Joe Foss Institute, which has a website, civicseducationinitiative.org, that you can go to learn about. And if your state is one of those states that doesn't require this test, then you can get involved in your state to hopefully promote that. A second thing that we might consider is something I'll call LEAD, which is an acronym that stands for, first, learn how to master the iron of the culture. The iron of the culture in our day is social media. We need to make edutainment videos. For example, on my website, I have what I call barnyard economic videos, and I use those to teach about the principles of economics in a humorous sort of way. Second, to engage the culture by using social media. Now, there are all sorts of courses. I've put some on my website that I advertise where you can learn to do this, but frankly, you can go on YouTube and other sources to find videos to teach you to do virtually anything. Third, to associate with other cultural conservatives. You don't have to do things by yourselves. And so one of the things that I think is important to do is to be able to work with others so that you keep yourself focused on doing things. And fourth is to discipline others to engage the culture. Notice that in a small way, by using the technology of this webinar, I'm doing exactly what I'm describing here. Now, I'm 61 years old. I remember back in the 1990s, there was a series of commercials called Harry and Louise, where they talked about Hillary Care and the dangers of nationalized health care. You can go watch those videos on YouTube. Today, anybody with a smartphone and a little bit of theatrical sense of flair for the dramatic can create online videos. On my own website, you can learn more about that concept. My feeling is that if I can learn how to do this, then a bunch of other baby boomers who have some sense of history in the Constitution can learn to do the same. A third thing to think about is that there's what's called Freedom of Information Act or FOIA requests that can be used to get government documents. Now, these can be used to open up information about what's going on at the state, local, and federal government levels. There's a group called openthebooks.com that has created an app that goes with your smartphone that you can then use to look for the budgets of your local, your state, and your federal government. And so a thought here is if you're a Tea Party person or a member of other conservative group, you can download this app and then use that app to get the budgetary data and combine that then with a Freedom of Information request to look at how federal funding for local, state, and federal, local and state programs are being affected by federal education policies, and then share that information through social media. For those people who are already teaching classes, there is an online learning platform called Canvas that is something that I teach in for various schools that I serve as an adjunct professor for. It is used in many public schools and even some homeschool corporations. And certainly I've seen that true in central Indiana where I live. Canvas has something called the Commons. The Commons is a learning object repository that enables educators to find, import, and share resources. It is a digital library full of educational content. Commons allows Canvas users to share learning resources with other users, as well as import learning resources into a Canvas course. So whether you're looking for an entire course or maybe just one lesson to augment what you're already doing, you can use this. Canvas is simply one example, so don't get fixated on a particular example like this one. If those people that are creating conservative courses were to begin to make that available and then publicize that through various conservative networks, that could help to turn the tide at the grassroots level. Finally, related to the above idea is to compile a reading or video movie list by grade level with a set of suggested lesson plans to use for age-appropriate audiences and courses. There's a vast network of homeschool advocates and private church school organizations that perhaps already have done this. It wouldn't be that hard if those national organizations that already are engaged in this sort of thing, like the Foundation for Liberty and American Greatness, or FLAG, were to begin to help to put this network together. And so those are the thoughts that I wanted to share with you today. I believe that these things are doable. I've put all the information and much more that I've talked about in this webinar in my book, The Unraveling of We the People. You can learn more about my book by going to www.theunraveling.us, and you can also search for the book on Amazon. It's available both in paperback and the Kindle as well. Well, I want to thank you for sticking with me through this webinar and being involved with this broadcast. I look forward to any comments that you might have. Later today, I'll be sending out a replay link to those who have signed up for the webinar, and down the road, others that you might want to share this with will be available through my YouTube channel. Well, thanks so much for your time, and God bless.